Hey there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind, where we are going to be talking about, do you know what you're feeling? I am talking about this today because a little while ago I got some feedback from one of the members of my SelfKind hub, and one of the things that she was saying in her feedback was that for the first time after being a member, she felt like she really learned how to feel. And that got me thinking about, why do we stop knowing how to do that? Because we certainly aren't born not knowing how to feel. So how do we lose that ability at some point in our lives? And then how can we actually get it back? So welcome to this episode. If you are new around here, I'm Webb. I'm a registered counsellor, a somatic exercise coach, and a yoga teacher. And this is a podcast for highly sensitive people. Sensitive folks who walk around sometimes feeling maybe a little different to everybody else, a little more sensitive, a little more emotional. And if that is you, you are absolutely in the right place. So we're going to talk, like I said today, about this idea of, do you know how you feel? And I think for the most part, when we're sensitive, we do think we know how we feel. And it can feel a little bit overwhelming to know how we feel at times, because the depth of our emotion can be quite significant, right? But it's also true that plenty of people who walk into my space, whether that's online or in person for counselling, there is this sense of disconnect. And we do often live quite head up as highly sensitive people. That can become a way of being for us, because we're very good at intellectualizing and, dare I even say, overthinking things. And so it can feel a little bit like your head is one thing and then your body is the other. And yet when we think about what does it mean to feel, it really is less of a thought process and more of a feeling process. And so sometimes that can make us feel a little bit stuck, or maybe even a little blind to how it is that we actually feel. So where I want to start with this is to talk a little bit about, why would that even happen? Why would we become disconnected? One of the reasons is exactly what I just talked about, right? We can tend to be quite cognitively driven and thinking about things and analyzing things and trying to figure things out through logic or just sheer force of will to think it through. And that can lead us to some level of disconnect between our mind and our body, partly because sometimes logic doesn't match up with the reality of how we feel. And so when we're faced with that mismatch, what do? We tend to prioritize the cognitive side of things because it is what is most prized in our society. It's what we know the most. So there's that. The other thing is, though, that when you are growing up in the world as a sensitive person, there is a very good chance that there were plenty of times in your life, and maybe even still now as an adult, where you were told that how you said you felt wasn't true because it was too much or too exaggerated or too overblown, right? You were reacting in ways that were just too big for the circumstances as other people saw them. And so when you are told, probably repeatedly, that how you feel isn't an accurate representation of reality or isn't true or shouldn't be that way, then of course you're going to disconnect on some level from how you feel, because if it's not right, then you can't trust it. So there's that piece. The other part of it is that, again, if you're a sensitive person, you are probably pretty adept at reading a room and knowing how other people are and what other people need you to be in order for them to be okay. So what can often happen in relationships where perhaps you're the sensitive one and there are other people in your space who maybe aren't as sensitive, or maybe also are sensitive, and you do this to each other, is that you might tend to prioritize the well-being of the people around you rather than your own. So you know when to say yes to keep them happy. You know when to say no to keep them happy. But rarely would you know when to do that for yourself to support how it is that you feel. And so you might be very well versed in kind of like doing that dance, right? Of, it doesn't matter how I feel. The priority is to keep the peace, keep mum happy, keep friend from getting mad at me, keep my siblings from picking on me, whatever it might be. But you become quite good at playing that role. And the information that you're using to act that out, I guess, for want of a better term, is how other people feel. And so if that's the information that you're using, the information about how you feel might well slip by the wayside. Then you have the reality of the empathic nature of what it is to be highly sensitive, keeping in mind that we all don't experience high sensitivity in the same way. And so for some, it might be like real sensory kind of sensitivity. For others, there might be more of that empathetic, I've lost my words there, empathetic or empathic kind of sensitivity, where that can be really overwhelming to be able to sense or connect with how other people feel. And so sometimes it might be hard to know how you feel because you don't know what is yours and what is somebody else's. So that's another complicating factor. And so, and one last thing is that because you feel things so deeply, there's also a chance that you just don't want to feel that. And so you push it away, you ignore it, you minimize it, you pretend it doesn't exist, because the depth of your own sadness or grief, shame, are too heavy a burden to hold. And so if you don't go to the depths of them, then, it feels safer. So that could be a few different reasons why sometimes even deeply feeling highly sensitive people end up feeling quite disconnected from the truth of how it is that they feel. Now, when we are not in touch with how we feel, I think we can cruise along okay for a time, but I think it really does come with some fairly significant consequences. And I want to run through some of those. And one of them is perhaps a little bit woo-woo, but I don't really think it is. It's just a word that tends to be associated with woo-woo. But if we're not connected with how we feel, then we are likely going to miss some of our intuitive nudges. We're going to miss those intuitive moments of, this is what is right, this is what I need, this is what I want, this is the path for me. We might miss those because we haven't got the capacity to discern what those intuitive moments feel like. We're also more liable to be stuck in a people-pleasing sort of state if we don't know how we feel. So we're more likely to say yes when we mean no. We're more likely to say no when we mean yes. We're more likely to gauge what to do and how to do it and when to do it based on how other people are feeling and what other people are doing and what other people are saying, rather than connecting with what it is that we want, need, or feel. And I think that when that happens, we're probably also more likely to slip into self-blame and self-shame and self-criticism when things don't go well. Equally, maybe we end up turning that out where it's not really warranted. So when we're not able to sort of sort through and sift through and discern what is mine, what am I holding, what is there for me to notice. And that's not to say that it's disconnected from the collective, because it absolutely isn't. We are part of a greater whole, but I think, get to this point when we're kind of not connected with how we feel, where we feel almost like a ping pong ball, right? Just being flung from one wall to the next, because we're not able to see the kind of shades of gray in between the two extremes. We end up just being like, we have these sort of big, broad categories of I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm not angry, like that kind of is the extent of it. And so we can feel like these ping pong balls where we don't have the capacity to discern where we're moving between, right? And that is one of the really powerful things when it comes to regulating overwhelm as a sensitive person, is if all we can sense and feel is the extremes, then we miss out on these wonderful opportunities to know which direction we're going in, because we might be experiencing one end of that extreme, and then throughout a day be kind of moving towards our red zone, right, where we feel really overwhelmed. But if we can't notice the subtle shifts that happen between one extreme to the other, then it's going to feel very much like we've just been slingshot, right, from one extreme to the other extreme, one which we experience probably quite pleasantly, and then the other one that feels awful. And so if we haven't sort of seen all these things that have contributed to that, internal and external, then where are we going to point the finger, right? Where are we going to find our explanation and understanding of that? We're probably either going to blame whatever that thing was that tipped us over the edge, or we're going to turn inward and be like, you're just always like this. You're just a bad person. You're just awful. And so I think, create a relationship with ourselves, or we foster a relationship with ourselves that is less than compassionate and less than kind. Whereas when we can connect with how we feel and see all of those shades of grey, then I think that really allows us to connect with this sense of compassion, because we realize that we aren't, just kind of these ping pong balls flinging from one side to the other. There's all this stuff that goes on under the surface, and we can see kind of the sensitivity and the vulnerability, I think, of our humanity. And when we can do that, we can really feel a lot more compassion for ourselves. I think that that sort of discussion there around this roller coaster of extremes, or this ping-ponging or slingshotting between extremes, is a really important one, because knowing what you feel gives you access to change how you feel. And that is really key. Now, that's not to say that we should always seek to change how we feel. Sometimes we simply need to be sad. Sometimes our anger is incredibly justified. So it's not about saying, well, if you know you're angry, at least you can come back to feeling less, not angry. It's not necessarily about that, but it's about having agency. It's about having choice. And we really lose our capacity for choice and agency when we're not aware of how things are moving, how things are changing, and how we actually feel. So there's a lot of really good reasons to reconnect with that feeling state of your body. Now, it's interesting when we talk about, knowing how you feel. I sort of mentioned at the start of this episode that there is this, bias towards a cognitive interpretation of how we feel when we talk about how we feel. And that is necessary, because we have to find language, right? If we're going to communicate how we feel to someone else, it requires language, which takes us straight to our brain. But what I want to talk about in terms of one of my favorite ways to reconnect with how you feel, is movement, and how you don't always have to have language to explain it when you are exploring it for yourself. So when I would work with somebody in terms of, a counseling relationship, and talking about that typical, how did that make you feel question that we hear joked about all the time in the movies. When that question is asked, oftentimes the answer that you will get will be very cognitive, because we're trying to find language to explain something that is felt. What can happen though when you're doing this exploration for yourself, or even with a counselor or a therapist, is get out of the sort of need, for the language to make sense and to be logical, and to just access literal feeling states. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I feel like it's a little bit of a nebulous concept. So if you're like, oh gosh, I'm not sure if I'm following, that's okay. I'm going to hopefully give you some fairly concrete examples of how to do this. And then you can explore the more nebulous parts within that structure, hopefully. That's the goal anyway. So my favorite way to start to learn how we feel is via a mindful movement practice. So I mentioned this student of mine who is a member of the SelfKind Hub, which is my online platform for mindful movement and going deeper into the things that we talk about here on the podcast. But one of the things that she told me was that being in that space and moving in the way that we do in the SelfKind Hub, she felt like it was the first time she was really able to feel. And I think that's what's super special about a mindful movement practice, because it is a practice of movement that really is about self-connection, not about exercise. Now, whenever I make a comment like that, I'm always a little bit worried that it's going to come off as though I think exercise is stupid. That could not be further from the truth. Exercise is very important. Exercise is wonderful for our mental health. Exercise is great for our body. Feeling strong is fantastic. It absolutely has a place. So please don't hear me saying, exercise is bad, because that is not what I'm saying. But mindful movement is different to that, because mindful movement is about moving mindfully, which allows us to connect more deeply with how we feel. And I think when we take away the sort of goals, I guess, that come associated with exercise, it opens a doorway to that awareness that I think sometimes isn't as present with exercise, but they can absolutely overlap. So what mindful movement does for us is it slows us down, and then it creates contrast. So we do movement, and then we pause, and we notice, how did it feel before? How did it feel during? And what does it feel like now? Really simple questions that don't always come with simple answers, but we cut out the need to necessarily find words for it, right? You don't have to verbalize that. You don't have to say, well, before it felt kind of lumpy and clunky and now it feels smooth. You could notice that that is not an emotion, right? So if I have done some movement through my shoulders, and before I did it, I noticed how I felt, then I did it, and I noticed how it felt to move, and then I check in and I notice how it feels after. I might have words like, it feels flatter or freer or softer or smoother, something like that. It doesn't really relate to an emotion, right? There's no emotion necessarily attached to that, but it's about finding and feeling and sensing contrast. I can say, before it felt a certain way, it felt a certain way while I was in action, and now it feels a certain way that I'm finished. And that difference can be quite subtle. And that is where we start to learn how to feel the grey, right? It's not the extreme. When we are uncomfortable in our body, we tend to only notice that, right? So if you have been really, really tense through your shoulders are going to be sort of sitting up around your ears. You might be experiencing pain and discomfort around that area. You tend to notice that because it's very, very loud. And then at some point, let's say you have a massage, you might notice like a really significant releasing of that, but rarely do you notice the gradual petering off of long-held tension. Usually it's only when you look in the rearview mirror that you go, I haven't been in as much pain recently, or I haven't had as many headaches, or I haven't had as many this, or I haven't had as many that. We tend to notice the really loud feeling, and we tend to notice at some point the absence of that. But what about all the shades of grey in between? And I think that's where our mindful movement practice can be so, so powerful. One of the things that I guess is important there is how you do that connecting, right? So I'm talking about noticing and noticing contrast. And even that can sometimes feel difficult to access. And so this is where we can also get really curious and be like, the noticing itself is hard because it hasn't been something that I've practiced. And so sometimes if somebody's really new to a mindful movement practice, you might kind of see them, moving their body, but really you can kind of almost see on their face and they're like, what is actually the point of this? This is not that interesting, not that fun, can feel quite distracted. And I think part of the reason for that is because sometimes what we are looking to feel is so subtle. And so it takes time to be able to sort of pull ourselves from our cognitive, what can be a very noisy, loud, rapidly moving space, our heads, and into an equally vast landscape of our body, but where we aren't as familiar with the noises, for want of a better term, right? So usually I think we have a really good sense of what does the inside of my head sound like. We might not be aware of the content necessarily, but we're aware of we spend so much time there that it's familiar. Whereas if you're just taking your attention to your body for the first time, or for the first time after a long while, or for the first time after a trauma, for the first time after injury, something like that, then you're learning a whole new landscape because it hasn't been where you've spent your time. And so this is where I think it can be really helpful to just lose language for a little bit as it pertains to noticing how you feel and just being present to sensation. It doesn't have to have words to go with it, which of course then makes it difficult to describe outward, but you don't always need to do that. Even when I'm working with a client in, that kind of capacity of one-on-one, sometimes it'll be, don't worry about trying to explain it to me, but just notice and be with sensation. Because our cognitive brain always wants to kick in. It is, that's the beauty of being human. We have access to this prefrontal cortex that gives us this wonderful capacity for thought and critical thinking and all the rest. But sometimes I think it does interfere with a capacity or an ease of noticing how we feel in our bodies. So, this is almost just a sales pitch, I guess, for mindful movement as being a really amazing way to connect with how you feel. But I want to talk a little bit about why that might also feel scary or sometimes even inaccessible, and how you can kind of modulate that a little bit, because that is a very real reality. We talked a little bit at the beginning about how, as highly feeling people, sometimes our own emotional states can be overwhelming. So if you have experienced grief or loss or sadness, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, that sometimes the depth of our own feeling can be so consuming and so distressing that it almost feels better and safer just to kind of like put it in a little box and set it to the side. Now, there is always room for that strategy. I think it's really important that we know that we can move our attention away from the thing that's uncomfortable. But that is where, maybe if you've locked those things up inside your body somewhere outside of your conscious awareness, then coming down to the body and sort of starting to notice, how does it feel? What's that contrast like? Will feel very vulnerable, because once you start to ease off some of the armoring and the tension and the protective mechanisms that you've put in place out of very real need and necessity, you might start to feel things that you don't really want to feel. And so I want to point out that that is a very real concern. And that is where then I would be recommending and suggesting that you do that alongside someone who can support you. It doesn't mean that they always necessarily have to be there while you do the movement, but at least to have somebody that you can debrief with, somebody that you can talk to about how to navigate that process. Because one of the things that happens, I guess, when we are connecting with how we feel and we're perhaps a little nervous about what we might find, is when we think about the strategies that we have for, maybe siphoning those things away from us and putting them in little protective places, that is protective, right? We are trying to keep ourselves safe when we employ those sorts of strategies. That is something that we've done to make ourselves feel better and safer in the world. So if we are going to start to loosen those protective mechanisms, if we're going to start to open them up, then we better have some other ways of feeling safe. Because if you don't, that's going to be where we shoot off into the red zone and we feel, very overwhelmed, because our body and our brain always needs that sense of safety in order to take those steps. And so I think that that's a really important thing to point out. For most of us, there'll be a level of exploration that we can do that does feel, okay. But if there's big stuff going on, if there are big things that you have sort of tucked away into the dark recesses, then you are going to want support to start to unfold some of that. This is why grounding practices are integral to mindful movement practices, at least in my world. Because if we're going to let stuff go, you hear that saying all the time, just like let it go, let it go, let it go. I could sing that, but I won't because that would be bad. But we hear that all the time. But there's a missing piece before that, which is let it go, but make sure that you have a way of being grounded and creating enough of a sense of safety in your body so that when you do find the capacity to start to feel, that you aren't doing the equivalent of sort of throwing yourself in the deep end without any capacity to swim. So we need to incorporate these grounding practices in our mindful movement practices, which are things like physical grounding, feeling your feet on the floor, breathing practices, finding an anchor within your body that feels like a sort of safe refuge, all kinds of things that we can do from a felt perspective, right? Still feeling, but that create this sense of being safe enough to feel what we need to feel. That, I think, is all I have to say about that. It's probably not all I have to say about that, but that feels like a good point to pause. So I want to just reiterate a couple of things. Mindful movement, towards the end there, it kind of, I'm mindful of the fact that I made that sound a little bit scary. It isn't scary, but I'm also really mindful of the fact that I don't know who's listening. And so you might have some really significant traumas that have been, put away. And if that's the case, then, we do need to be really mindful about how we go about this. If that is not true, and there's this sense of just a disconnect between body and mind that you are really keen to dissolve, right? Like bring them together, then some of that won't apply as significantly, right? But I want to make sure that I am being really mindful and trauma informed as I talk about this, because it is not the same for everybody. And I think as you're listening, hopefully you know which category or which kind of group you would fall into there. But ultimately the takeaway is, if you are a deeply feeling sensitive person, but you feel disconnected from your own feelings, you're not alone. That is not unusual, and it doesn't have to be how things stay. And so incorporating mindful movement practices into your self-care is key. And in terms of making this really simple, obviously, I teach mindful movement. I have a million zillion classes. But if you want to make it really, really simple, start with something that is very, very simple and do joint rotations, right? So anything that you can circle in your body, just circle it. Circling your shoulders, your wrists, your elbows, your hips, your knees, your ankles. It sounds very simple, and it is, but you'll notice that when you move those joints, there are lots of different things to feel. So particularly if you lie down or sit and rotate your ankles, you might notice that at certain points of that movement, you feel pulling or stretching or some sensation like that isn't present in the same spot as you continue the circle. And so there's little things like that. Oh, I feel my calf pull a little bit when I do it that way. Oh, the top of my foot is kind of tight when I do it that way. Ah, that's interesting. When I reverse the direction, it feels a little different. Making a circle feels hard. Little things like that. Yes, it's not an emotional state, but it starts to give you the capacity to notice contrast, to notice subtleties, and to start to tap into the feelings of your body, not just the thoughts that sit in your mind. All right, my friends, I hope that is helpful. You can absolutely reach out to me if you have questions. If you want to work on any of this stuff one-on-one, I do have capacity for one-on-one counseling clients at the moment, so you can find the link in the show notes to more information about that. Otherwise, I will look forward to being back with you really soon.